When a superpower like the United States decides to end a trade war on its own terms, it doesn't lead with threats or televised drama. Instead, the process looks entirely routine, almost like a standard business transaction. It begins with a quiet, high-level phone call placed through secure government channels to avoid any public leaks. A formal proposal is delivered, outlining exactly what the superpower wants and what it is willing to give in return. There is no loud ultimatum, but a deadline is always implied by the tone of the conversation. The expectation is that the smaller neighbor, facing immense economic pressure, will see the offer as a lifeline and accept it immediately. In this case, Washington delivered its terms and waited for the inevitable yes that would restore the old North American order. What followed was 96 minutes of absolute silence. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, silence is usually a sign of frantic internal debate or desperate negotiation, but here, it was the prelude to a historic shift in power. When the clock hit the 96-minute mark, the silence broke with a response that was the most expensive answer the United States had ever received. The offer was not met with a counter-proposal, a request for more time, or a list of grievances to be negotiated. It was a flat, total rejection. This was a moment where the traditional gravity of Washington's influence failed to pull Ottawa into alignment. The speed of the no sent a shockwave through the White House, because it proved that Canada was no longer operating out of fear or economic desperation. This rejection carried a message that moved faster than any market update or political tweet. Canada was choosing its own sovereignty over American convenience. For weeks, the White House had been operating under the belief that its strategy of maximum pressure, which included escalating tariffs on Canadian goods and reacting to Canada's mineral export freeze, would force Ottawa to break. The US administration thought it was restoring control over the continent's economy, but the reality on the ground was forcing a painful recalibration. American factories were stalling, and the stock market was reacting to the sudden shortage of essential materials. The superpower wasn't actually in control, it was reacting to a crisis it had underestimated. As the internal pressure in the US became unbearable, the public aggression from Washington suddenly softened. What had been a series of public confrontations shifted into what insiders described as stabilization outreach. The US proposal was designed to look like a fair deal and an easy exit for both sides. The terms were simple. Canada would immediately lift its export restrictions on critical minerals like nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements. These are the vitamins of the modern economy, essential for everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced military hardware. In exchange, the US would suspend its latest round of heavy tariffs on Canadian aluminum and automobiles. It was presented as a reset and a cooling-off period to return to mutually beneficial cooperation. However, the entire offer was built on a deeply flawed and outdated assumption. Washington believed that the economic pain of the trade war was lopsided. The US officials assumed that because the American market is so large, Canada would be more desperate to sell its cars and aluminum than the US would be to buy Canadian minerals. They viewed the mineral freeze as a temporary tantrum that could be solved with a standard trade swap. What they failed to see was that the world had changed. Canada wasn't just a warehouse for the US anymore. It had become a global power player in the green energy race. By the time the US made its routine offer, Canada had already realized that its minerals were more valuable than US market access. The 96-minute rejection wasn't just a no to a deal, it was a no to the idea that Washington gets to set the rules for North American industry. Washington's strategic error began with a fundamental miscalculation of urgency. The US government operated under the firm belief that the current economic crisis was a burden shared equally by both nations. They assumed that because American electric vehicle EV assembly lines were slowing down and critical defense supply chains were beginning to crack, Ottawa must be experiencing the exact same level of panic. In the eyes of the White House, the pain of a trade war was supposed to be a symmetrical force, a mutual pressure that would naturally push both sides to seek a quick, face-saving resolution. Washington framed the phone call as a pragmatic off-ramp, inviting Canada to accept a compromise, claim a symbolic diplomatic victory, and return to the status quo of open trade. To the US, the deal was common sense. To Canada, the offer was a sign that the Americans still didn't understand the new reality. For decades, the invisible architecture of North American trade was built on a single, rigid foundation, the assumption that Canada needed the American market for its survival far more than America needed Canada's raw resources. This belief that the US consumer market was the sun around which all other economies orbited had dictated the terms of every negotiation for generations. Washington's mid-morning call to Ottawa was essentially a test of this old architecture. The American messaging was designed to be reassuring and familiar. They pointed to the escalating trade war, the nervous financial markets, and the pressure from governors of industrial states as clear evidence that the situation had become untenable. By framing the offer as a way to restore stability, the US was essentially asking Canada to concede because it assumed Canada had no other choice. However, Washington's greatest mistake was failing to recognize that the strategic timing had shifted entirely in Canada's favor. While US officials were obsessing over headlines and tariff schedules, they were completely blind to the fact that international competitors were already moving. Delegations from Europe and Asia had been quietly arriving in Ottawa for weeks, engaged in deep, substantive negotiations that were no longer speculative. These were not just exploratory meetings. They were formal, contractual discussions aimed at securing long-term mineral supplies. Canada's nickel, lithium, cobalt, and graphite hadn't disappeared from the earth, they were simply being redirected. Replacement buyers from overseas were lining up, not out of sympathy for Canada's position, but out of a desperate, cold-blooded need to secure their own industrial futures. Inside the Canadian cabinet, the decision-making process was stripped of all political emotion. It was a purely mathematical calculation of future leverage. The government looked at the two available paths and realized that the outcome would define Canada's industrial identity for the next 20 years. The first path, reinstating exports to the United States, offered the comfort of immediate market stabilization, but it came with a permanent cost. It would restore the exact same US leverage that had allowed Washington to threaten Canada with tariffs in the first place. It would essentially lock Canada back into a cycle of dependency where its prosperity was subject to the whims of US trade policy. The second path was the decision to maintain the restrictions, which the Canadian government recognized as a catalyst for long-term independence. While this route would certainly intensify short-term volatility and economic pain, it acted as a forced march toward diversification. By keeping the minerals off the US market, Canada effectively forced global manufacturers to bypass the American supply chain and sign direct long-term deals with Canadian suppliers. This move was designed to break the single customer trap that had defined Canada's trade policy for nearly a century. In the minds of Canadian strategists, the choice was clear: continue living in a system where they were the vulnerable subordinate, or use their natural resources to force a restructuring of the global market. They didn't just choose to reject the US offer, they chose to redefine the very nature of the relationship. Exactly 96 minutes after the US proposal was officially delivered to Ottawa, the response was sent back. The brevity of Canada's message was just as important as its content. The Canadian government stated that there would be absolutely no reversal of export controls as long as American economic coercion, specifically the existing tariffs, remained in place. There was to be no middle ground, no partial restoration of shipments, no good faith symbolic deliveries to ease market pressure, and no phased re-entry into the US supply chain. By keeping the response so short and firm, Canada signaled that its policy decision was not something to be negotiated under the threat of trade penalties. The message was unmistakable. Canada's national resource policy was no longer an instrument of convenience for its neighbour, but a firm exercise of sovereign authority. The incredible speed of this rejection, coming less than 2 hours after a high-stakes proposal, revealed a hidden reality. It was clear that the answer had been drafted and vetted by the Canadian cabinet long before the US call was even placed. There was no internal scrambling, no emergency debates in the halls of Parliament, and no visible hesitation among Canadian officials. This proved that the decision was structural rather than reactive. Canada had already fundamentally changed its direction, mapping out a new future for its resource industry that existed independently of American market demands. The American proposal, which Washington hoped would restore the old power dynamic, was effectively dead on arrival because the underlying economic geography had already shifted. The reaction from the financial markets was immediate and brutal. As soon as the news broke that Canada had refused to budge, American electric vehicle EV stocks plummeted, reflecting the sudden fear of a supply chain collapse. Major battery suppliers, caught off guard by the finality of the rejection, were forced to slash their production guidance because they had no backup plan for the loss of Canadian lithium, nickel, and cobalt. In the world of high finance analysis, a new jarring phrase began to dominate the headlines: strategic decoupling. This term, which had been completely absent from economic forecasts only 2 weeks earlier, described the reality that North America was no longer functioning as a single, seamless industrial unit. The decades-old assumption of a unified continental supply chain was dissolving in real time, and the markets were scrambling to price in the consequences. In Washington, the frustration inside the White House turned public. The president dismissed the rejection as short-sighted, while various advisors frantically floated the possibility of invoking emergency federal powers to bypass environmental regulations and fast-track domestic mining projects. However, this rhetoric hit a hard wall of physical reality. Geology does not care about political deadlines or urgent news cycles. It takes years of complex environmental assessments, infrastructure development, and massive capital investment to turn a raw mineral deposit into a functional mine. Even with the full weight of the US government pushing for acceleration, permits do not become production overnight. While American officials were tied up in political debates, the rest of the world was moving with decisive speed. Global buyers, seeing the writing on the wall, were already finalizing long-term contracts with Ottawa. These deals were built on timelines measured in years and decades, ensuring that Canadian resources were being locked into secure, non-American supply chains. Because these global partners were willing to offer long-term financial certainty and infrastructure cooperation, they were able to secure the minerals that the United States so desperately needed. By the time Washington fully grasped the gravity of the situation, the supply had already been promised elsewhere, leaving American industry to face the reality of a significantly more expensive and insecure future. Washington's most critical error was the belief that the clock was Canada's enemy. The White House assumed that because the United States has the world's largest consumer market, time would inevitably force Ottawa to fold. Inside the US, industrial hubs in states like Michigan and Georgia were already seeing production lines slow down and temporary layoffs announced, creating a surge of political panic among governors and federal lawmakers. They believed that by creating economic pressure, they could trigger a swift reversal from Canada. However, Canada saw the situation differently. They realized they controlled the bottleneck of the modern industrial age. The American transition to clean energy had been built like a massive, expensive skyscraper, but its foundation was entirely dependent on raw minerals extracted from Canadian soil. Without a steady supply of Canadian nickel, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the American clean energy supply chain did not just bend under the pressure, it effectively snapped. Unlike manufactured products like cars or electronics, which can often be sourced from different factories or substituted with alternative parts, raw minerals are bound by geology. You cannot simply build a new mine to replace a closed one, nor can you easily reroute global supply chains that have been developed over decades. Industry experts estimated that even with an all-out effort, it would take the United States roughly a decade to develop enough domestic mining capacity to achieve true independence. During that 10-year window, Canada's resources were already being locked away through long-term multi-billion-dollar contracts with Germany, South Korea, and Japan, leaving the US with very few viable options for replacement. As the standoff intensified, the impact of the mineral freeze quickly moved beyond the civilian automotive market and into the highly sensitive realm of national security. Defense analysts and military planners began to issue urgent warnings to the Pentagon. Modern fighter jets, high-precision missile guidance systems, and advanced naval vessels all relied on the very specific materials currently under Canadian export control. Specialized alloys, rare earth magnets for targeting sensors, and nickel-intensive steel for submarine hulls were suddenly in short supply. For years, the United States had poured its energy into mitigating strategic risks from distant global adversaries, only to discover a profound and immediate vulnerability sitting right across its northern border, a vulnerability created not by foreign hostility, but by a sudden breakdown in diplomatic trust. Every new threat or tariff increase from the White House served only to harden Canada's resolve rather than break it. Instead of caving to the pressure, Ottawa began quietly and effectively funding infrastructure projects designed to bypass the American market entirely. They authorized new westbound export terminals and expanded rail capacity to move raw materials toward Pacific ports, while simultaneously upgrading Atlantic shipping routes to better serve European demand. Canada was pivoting its entire export strategy toward a global market where demand for these minerals was already skyrocketing. By the time Washington realized the scope of the shift, the North-South supply chains that had tied the two nations together for generations were already being dismantled in favor of East-West trade routes, fundamentally changing the architecture of global industrial power. This historic confrontation fundamentally transformed the definition of industrial power. For the first time in modern history, resource sovereignty emerged as the dominant, defining theme of the relationship between Washington and Ottawa. Canada effectively proved to the world that true economic leverage does not always flow from having the largest gross domestic product, GDP, or the biggest consumer market. Instead, power now flows from whoever controls the essential, irreplaceable inputs required to run a 21st-century economy. While the US messaging remained fixed on the language of winning, treating the dispute like a zero-sum game of political ego, Canada's messaging was strictly about terms. This was never a temporary, superficial trade squabble. It was a profound structural shift. The 96-minute rejection was the turning point that signaled Canada was no longer willing to align its national interests automatically with US demands simply because of pressure or proximity. Ultimately, the trade war collided with the cold, unyielding reality of physical geography. While the United States faced mounting industrial drag, slowing production lines, and rising costs, Canada gained something far more valuable: optionality. This is the ability to strategically choose one's partners rather than being trapped in a single buyer dependency. The long-held, comfortable assumption that the larger economy would always outlast the smaller one was proven wrong, because the smaller economy held the very keys to the future of the clean energy transition. As international contracts were finalized and global manufacturing giants recalculated their supply chain futures, the shift became undeniable. The ground beneath Canada had not moved, but the global balance of power built upon that ground certainly had. Canada successfully transitioned from being a passive supplier of raw materials to an active, sovereign architect of its own industrial destiny. This new era established a clear precedent. In a world hungry for the building blocks of technology and defense, the ability to control supply chains is the ultimate form of influence, and Canada had decisively claimed its place as a leader in that new competitive reality.